Hey everyone, welcome to chapter 12. This time we're talking about learning and memory. This is one of my favorite units because I've spent basically my whole career researching learning and memory and rats. So I love talking about learning and memory, so this is going to be a good week. So as just a brief little aside, Namaste is the Greek goddess of memory. Well, more accurately, she's a titan, but that doesn't really matter. Her name was traditionally invoked by ancient Greek poets at the start of retelling a story, sort of a plea to have good memory of the events that happened. So I thought it was fitting to sort of mention her name, Namaste, and while we're starting this unit on memory. Also because her name is the root of other words that we use when we're talking about memory, like mnemonic, right? So it comes from the same root. All right, first off, we're going to be talking about classical conditioning, about as basic as learning gets. This will be a refresher for most of you, so let's try to go through it kind of quickly. Okay, so to review what you likely already know about classical conditioning, a conditional stimulus, or CS, that initially elicits no response, we might call it a neutral stimulus to start, because paired with an unconditional stimulus, a US, that elicits an unconditional response, a UR. So an unconditional stimulus is something that elicits the unconditional response without any sort of training or experience. That's why it's called unconditional. So something like food, for example, right, might produce the unconditioned response of salivation, right? You don't have to learn to salivate when you see food. It's something that you do innately, and it's not learned. So repeated pairings of the previously neutral stimulus with the unconditional stimulus will make it into a conditioned stimulus because it elicits a conditioned response. Right, so in the example of classical eye blink conditioning, this is a really classic paradigm. A tone, which is a conditioned stimulus, is paired with an air puff to the eye, the unconditioned stimulus. So both the unconditioned response and the conditioned response in this instance are a blink of the eyelid, right? So if you get a puff of air to your eye, if you've ever been to the eye doctor and had a glaucoma test, that's unpleasant but not painful. You will blink when you receive a puff of air to the eye. If you have a tone that predicts the occurrence of that air puff, you will learn to blink in anticipation, right? You perform the conditioned response of a blink to the conditioned stimulus of a tone, right? The tone predicts the occurrence of the air puff, so you blink when you hear the tone. That's basically classical conditioning. So I've posted an example video of classical conditioning, a little clip from The Office on Perusal, so watch that. So pause this video, watch that, then come back here. Okay, welcome back. In that little example, we have the Windows startup tone, right? That sound that we all hear all the time. And to Dwight, this doesn't really mean much of anything, right? It's just a normal piece of background noise in the office. So we would call this a neutral stimulus, or an NS. Has no real value, doesn't predict anything, it's meaningless. So no response is produced. Next part of the equation, we have altoids. These are food, right? You don't need to know anything about them. You know that you want them because they're food and you like how they taste, right? So unconditioned stimulus, altoid ments. This produces the unconditioned response that we'll just call desire for altoid, right? Unconditioned response could be something like salivation or behavior to get those altoids, right? That's our unconditioned response. So during classical conditioning, we pair those two stimuli and then produce the unconditioned response, right? So the Windows startup tone is neutral and the altoids are an unconditioned stimulus. But these are paired together in a way that allows for the Windows tone to become predictive. It happens before the unconditioned stimulus arrives, but not with much time in between. They're pretty temporally paired closely together. So tone happens, altoids are presented, and our unconditioned response takes place, that desire for the altoid. So after classical conditioning, the tone is presented, and lo and behold, it produces the same response as the altoid did with no training. So what do we call these things now? Well, the Windows startup tone is now a conditioned stimulus. Why? Because it elicits a conditioned response. So the conditioned stimulus, the CS, this tone presented on its own, now elicits the desire for altoid response, the conditioned response, right? In this instance, again, the conditioned response and the unconditioned response are the same, though they are not necessarily always the same. So I'm going to mention now the idea of Hebbian plasticity, though we are going to come back to this later and in much greater detail. But basically, the Hebb rule, or Hebbian plasticity, is the cellular basis of learning that involves strengthening of a synapse that is repeatedly active when the postsynaptic neuron fires. That's pretty complicated, but we'll unpack it a bit, right? Basically, what you can remember with Hebbian plasticity is the idea that cells that fire together wire. So to go back to our air puff, eye blink conditioning example, think about this super sort of simplified circuit diagram, right? We have a motor neuron here that produces our blink response, right? This neuron has to be activated for us to close our eyes and blink. So it may not surprise you to have the idea that our somatosensory system, our sensation of touch system, is strongly wired to our motor system, right? So when we receive a puff of air to our eye, it activates our somatosensory neurons that detect the presence of that air puff. They synapse onto our motor neurons that govern our blinking response. It's a strong synapse, right? It's easy for this pathway to activate the blink pathway and to cause us to close our eyes, right? Something touches near our eye, we shut our eye. Happens fast, happens easily. It's also true that our auditory system can send information to this neuron as well, right? Though this is a weak synapse. We don't have the default response of a regular sound in our environment causing us to blink. That would be very strange. It's not adaptive to blink every time you hear any noise. However, there's still a connection here. Hebbian plasticity is the idea that if these two cells are firing at the same time, it can strengthen the weak synapse, right? So basically, if this neuron that's representing the tone fires at around the same time that this air puff detecting neuron is firing, this synapse can become strengthened. So that way in the future, when you hear just this tone, you blink, right? That's the basis of learning, really, of associative learning at least, right? The idea that this synapse can be strengthened. So before you have any experience being puffed in the eye, you won't blink when you hear a tone. But after, you will. And the connectivity change that supports that happens right here. And again, we're going to talk way more in depth about this mechanism. So if this isn't totally gelling right now, don't worry too much about it because we're going to hit this way harder when we talk about long-term potentiation. So this takes place in a lot of systems. One of the systems that supports classical conditioning is the amygdala. We talked about this in some depth when we did emotion, so I'm not going to linger on this for too long. But this is basically the idea that an aversive stimulus, such as a foot shock, produces a sort of autonomic behavioral response. So the aversive stimulus, pictured in red here, has a strong synapse with neurons in our lateral nucleus, whereas the tone has a weak synapse with some of the same neurons in our lateral nucleus. So through that sort of Hebbian process we've just talked about in the previous slide, if these things happen at around the same time, the tone CS information comes in around the same time as the US aversive stimulation, and they're going to help change the strength of the tone synapse. So that way, fear learning can take place, right? The tone will elicit the same fear responses that the foot shock type aversive stimulus will elicit because of the change in connectivity between our auditory system and these neurons here that are important for fear learning. Okay, that's it for our basic overview of classical conditioning. Next time we're on to operant conditioning.